Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be, everyone. This is another webinar about the WebCon way. Today's topic is all about how WebCon BPS does rules right. And before we get into what today's webinar is like, I just want to call everyone's attention to the fact that next week we have another webinar. We're trying to do webinars rather frequently, maybe not every week, but almost every week. And next week's webinar is how WebCon BPS addresses agile organizations. It's not about one feature, it's about a set of different features that are all about the fact that WebCon realizes that organizations are not static creatures. They go through mergers, they go through acquisitions, they go through sell-offs. The same person doesn't necessarily, that is assigned a task, doesn't necessarily wind up completing the task. There might be substitutions or delegates or surrogates that get involved part of the time. Tasks sometimes get reassigned. We also might have processes that have different settings, different preferences, and even different paths that they go through depending on which business unit within the organization is involved. We actually have stuff built into the platform to accommodate all of this. And we will talk about features that make all of this work and how it improves organizational behavior next week. So I wanted to make sure that you knew about that so that you tuned in next week. But now, and tell your friends, get them to come too. But now let's get on to the subject of today's webinar, which is all about rules. Now, why rules? It's because not all business logic works as a diagram. Not all of it. I mean, obviously, we are very, very fond of drag and drop graphical design. But sometimes some things are best expressed in a way that you read as opposed to look at. And also, even whether they were done with something that looks like text or expressions, or whether they were done visually, the idea of having one piece of logic be easily reused in other places is an incredibly important concept. In fact, if you look at the way analysts tend to evaluate different vendor offerings and so on, business rules is a major category. And in fact, if you don't have them, it's considered to be a deficiency. So a library of easily used business rules matters a lot. And what's more, I might want to encapsulate that logic so that I can change it later. Just because I have one means of calculating how addresses are formatted or what the discount rate is for a particular customer doesn't mean I'm going to always do it that way. And if I wind up changing the way something is resolved or calculated or decided, I don't want to necessarily have to change every business process out there that depends on it. So rules are a really good thing. Now, where can you use rules in WebCon BPS? Lots and lots of places. Within a field, you can have rules. That's for refining whether or not to display a field, whether or not to make a field editable, whether or not to make a field required. All of that's subject to rules. We can modify the behavior of a form based on what's going on inside of a field. It's pretty easy. The form itself, we can have things happen when the form loads. We can have things happen when we move along a workflow path and evaluate business rules to determine whether or not to go down a path at all or how to go down a path. We can validate things in a custom way. We can assign tasks to people using business rules. And we can just have ad hoc business rules that act like, a function. It can be used within other rules. It can be used all over the place. Our rule architecture is everywhere. And I think within the last minute or so, I've said form rules and business rules. It's probably a good idea for us to differentiate between them. Most of the time, you will probably barely care until you really need to care. So let's talk specifically about the difference between form rules and business rules. They look largely alike. And if you want examples, don't worry. We're going to go into a ton of examples in a few minutes, but I really want to talk, especially if you look at these slides or look at the recording of this afterwards. I want you to make sure that you've got some slides that explain philosophically what's going on. So form rules are executed on the front end, in your browser, in your mobile app. They are allowed to interact with the user interface. And the reason that they can do that is that we resolve them, we transform them into JavaScript and execute them as JavaScript. In fact, we even give you, we don't necessarily go around encouraging you to do this, but we give you the option to write a form rule as JavaScript instead of in our rules language. Now, that is a form rule. A business rule, on the other hand, is executed by our workflow engine in the back end. It interacts with data. Form rules are designed to interact with the user interface. So they can lift form values out and manipulate forms and do all kinds of clever interactive things. But in the back end, fetching data from other places, doing complex calculations and so on, returning values, that is the purview of business rules. They can also interact with code. You can register blocks of code. We have an API for doing that. And if you do that, a business rule can execute code. We are also able to return values from business rules. Form rules are designed to do something. Business rules are designed to answer something or get something for you. And that could be who is supposed to be assigned to a task. That could be whether or not a field is valid. There are lots of different things, but the idea is you're returning a value. Often that's a yes, no, a Boolean value, but sometimes it's much more than that. Also, business rules are designed to be used by something else. They don't really stand alone. They're meant to be used by other things. So they can be used inside of a task assignment action, but they can also be called by form rules. And that is kind of handy. In fact, in both cases, nesting is possible. So a form rule can call another form rule. A form rule can call a business rule. A business rule can call a business rule. The only thing that's not possible is a business rule cannot call a form rule, because a business rule might execute when there is no user interface. In both cases, you can sometimes, depends on the circumstances, test out your rule before you actually put it into play. In other words, just to test out your logic. Given time, I will run through that today. What are some other things I can, oh, right, rule catalogs. Rule catalogs are great. We can have catalogs of form rules, catalogs of business rules. You can have catalogs of both kinds of rules that are scoped to a process so that they can be used within that process. And remember, one process can have multiple workflows and multiple forms and a whole catalog of available fields. So if I create a rule and scope it to a process, it can be reused rather widely. But if you would like to share a rule across multiple processes or multiple applications for that matter, we do have a global catalog of business rules that are supported. And when you package and deploy an application, that will automatically include any externalities that it depends on. So if you have a dependency on a global business rule and you deploy an application from your test environment to your production environment or something to that effect, that's not a problem at all. It will install the global business rule at the same time. If it turns out the global business rule is already there, you'll be given the option to just use the one that's already present or overwrite it. We're quite graceful about that. Now, paradoxically, there are a couple of things that are worth taking note of. At least one special form rule is executed in the workflow designer. It's for custom validation. You'll see this in a few moments. Remember, I guess what I'm getting at is in WebCon, and maybe it's best if I just show this to you. This is the WebCon BPS application design. It's our designer studio, and we're looking at a workflow here. And I'm looking at the layout of a form right here, and here's my catalog of fields and so on. Now, what you aren't seeing is one workflow designer and one form designer and one report designer. You're seeing an application designer. So it is possible for me to manipulate the form from the workflow and to manipulate the workflow from the form. So there's one form rule that actually appears in the workflow designer. It's for custom validation. I'll show it to you in a little bit. And some of the rules that show up in field definitions technically are business rules, like whether or not we're going to allow a field to be editable or required. Well, this is a rule logic that returns a value. It's a business rule by definition. So again, we will come back to all of this in examples in just a few minutes, but just wanted to make sure you got the idea that it isn't form rules that are designed in the form designer and business rules designed in the workflow designer. All of them could be used in both places. Some rules in the form designer are actually business rules. Yeah, I mentioned that already. All right, another thing that's paradoxical. You need, even though we've got all this great support for business rules and form rules in WebCon BPS, you need fewer rules with WebCon BPS. Yeah, here, I'll show you what I'm talking about. One of the biggest reasons why people use business rules, or form rules, I should say, is that they might have a bunch of fields in a form, but they don't necessarily want them to be visible or editable at all times. So for example, I might decide that I only want the title of my request to be editable at the start of the process when someone fills out the form. And that's okay. I'm fine with that. And I might allow the description to be editable, but not required. I don't want any, if a title is good enough, we might not need a description. And therefore, I don't need in our universe to go ahead and write a rule to say if it's the start, or make it required, and if it's the start, make it optional, or hide it if we get to canceled, or any of a number of things like that. I've got this field matrix. This cuts down on 80 to 90% of all the rules that you normally need to do with other products. So here at the start, the title, I want that to be visible, and I want it to be required. And when it's being reviewed, I want it to be visible, but I don't want the reviewer to change the title. If the reviewer doesn't like it, she can send it back to the author. But I don't want her making changes to it. Now, description, I said I would keep editable but optional, but I don't want anyone touching it here in the review stage. And then when it's finished, I definitely don't want anyone to change history, so everything is read-only there. Same thing with here in canceled. Canceled, I want to have look just like finish, same editability and displayability status, so I will do that. All right. And let's see, when it's being reviewed, we have a bunch of other fields, but we'll come back to this. The main point is our field matrix is designed to eliminate most of the rules that you would normally need to do in other products. And it eliminates the need to have one form for the start step, a different form for review, a different form for finish, a different form for canceled. We have one form that morphs itself depending on what your needs are. And this eliminates a lot of rule logic. The next most important thing that's a little bit on the paradoxical side. Rules look like text. You want to see, but they're actually drag and drop creatures. We're dragging and dropping blocks of text and formula elements. It can be drag and drop, it can be point and click, and you can do freeform typing and will auto-complete it into objects. But although rules look like text, they're actually well-governed constructs, and we will make sure that you don't make mistakes. You may make logical errors, but you won't make syntactical errors. So even they look like expressions, they look like script, but they're actually much more structured and governed and verified, pre-verified than free-form expressions where you're just typing text. You won't make a spelling error that breaks it. You might make a logic error that breaks it, but you won't make a spelling error that breaks a rule. All right, I think in many cases, it's hard to explain how rules work without going through a bunch of scenarios. So let's do that. Let's begin with a conditional field display. This is a common reason for doing these things. So I am going to, at the outset, I want to have certain fields appear and not other fields. Now I have made every field in this form visible at the start. And you know something, I'm going to make everything read only during the review stage. We might refine this. In fact, we are totally going to refine this, but let's begin from this point of view. And let me show you what the form looks like. Here in the webinar section, I have my rules demo application, and I have one report here that's listing all the current items. There aren't any yet, but if I click here on new, I should see a form that allows me to put in, well, any of a number of things. The title of my idea, the description, and then I want to say what state we want to execute this in. And I have some extra fields in here, like California, and yes, I'm playing to stereotypes, but California has a lot of new age people living in it, so the chakra level of my idea I need to put in if it's from California. And if someone is from Michigan, that is the state in the United States that looks like a hand. And a lot of people from Michigan, when you ask them where they're from, they will point to a place on their hand to indicate where they are. So I'm going to ask for position on the hand if the state is Michigan. And if you're in Washington State, where I live, I live in Seattle, Starbucks is headquartered here, and you actually can't walk 2 blocks without encountering not one, but several Starbucks. So I want to know, if you live in Washington State, which Starbucks locations are near you, and so on. So I have set myself up to have a lot of conditional display stuff here, and I want it to be based on which state you're in. So let's go ahead and make that adjustment here. Now, if we're going to do this behavior here in state, and what I am going to do, I have 2 options for doing this. This is my variable, or my field. It's called a state. It's a choice field. It's getting its data from a SQL table or a table of US states, districts, and territories. And if you want to see what the data looks like, we can test it. So there's a numeric ID. The name is the 2-letter abbreviation, and the description contains the full name of the state. All right, that's good to know. Am I displaying all of them? Let's check it out. Yep, I'm displaying everything I need. All right, here under style and behavior is where I am allowed to make changes when a state is selected. So here's a form rule to be executed on value change. And so what I am going to do is if, depending on the state, we'll show some things and not others. So how about I introduce you to the form editor. Typically this ... this ellipsis here, it's worth it because if we go in here, we get the entire form editor environment. So what I see here is a place to put, well, I have a listing of all system fields, the current workflow, all form fields in the current form, any context variables, any global constants or process constants. I even have information about all the applications and data sources and business entities in my organization. And I have here a set of functions that I can call and a set of operators. So what I want here to start with is if then, because if it's California, I want to display chakras. And if it's Washington, I want to display Starbucks. So I'm dragging and dropping that expression, and in this comes. Now, this is not text. This is a structured object. This is a parameter I'm going to put in here. So I need an expression to put right there. And so it's going to be if state equals something. So here under comparisons, I'm going to drop this in. And here is where I'm going to choose state. And we do have a form field called state. And state has got three ways to express its value. One is the ID, that would be the number. Name, that would be that two-letter abbreviation. And ID and name, they'd be separated by a pound sign, sometimes called a hash mark. I want the name. So if state name equals California, and I don't need quotation marks. If it's a literal string literal, it'll be in italics. By the way, if I realized I got it wrong, I can right click right here and switch to using the ID or ID and name. Everything can be adjustable within reason if you right click on it. So if I accidentally put equals in here and realized I needed not equals, it's actually pretty easy to make that change. So if state name equals California, what do I want to have happen? I want to go here to behavior, and I want to hide or show something. So if it's California, yeah, show the field named, where is it, chakra level. Otherwise, hide the chakra level. And where is that function called hide? There it is. And let's put this here and chakra level. All right, let's click OK. Let's click save, and let's try it out. I'll reload this form, and you'll notice we're running into a little issue, but I'm going to show you how we fix this in just a moment. Chakra level's already being displayed, but if I choose another state, there, it vanished because the state is not California. But if I choose California, chakra level appears. Now, why did this happen? Because the rule is only being executed when a value changes in state. It's not executing when the form first loads. This is fine. I made that mistake so that I could teach you something. Now, this logic I have showing up here under form rule to be executed on value change. And for lightweight operations, it's perfectly okay to put rule logic directly in this box, directly tightly coupled to the state. The thing is, if you expect to use this logic more than once or in more than one place, you sure as heck shouldn't create it in every location and copy it. It's a maintenance nightmare. So let's do this instead. I am going to come down here to configuration. And here in configuration, I have a place to put business rules and form rules. Now this is, I'm manipulating form behavior. I'm not returning a value. So this is going to be a form rule. And I'm going to create a new form rule that says California specific stuff. All right. I'm editing it as a form rule, and I was able to paste all that stuff in here. So I like this, and I'm going to go back here to state, and I'm going to get rid of this. And instead, I'm just going to go here to functions, and I notice now that I have some process form rules. Here's this one called California specific stuff. Now I can drag and drop it into position. That'll totally work, but I'm going to teach you something else right now. If I click here and create an insertion point, I can just double click here and it'll insert it in the insertion point. And you can even hover over this and see what it is that's going to happen. Now this is handy because yes, I have removed the logic from inside of the form or the field definition, and I've relegated it to an external or a cataloged form rule. But that means that I can call this in other places, including the main form. This is the behavior when the form loads, and I'm going to call it right here too. And in fact, this will allow me to introduce you to yet one more thing. Yes, I can do drag and drop. Yes, I can do double click to insert, but I can also do autocomplete and auto resolve. So it's not autocomplete so much as auto resolve or auto search. So let me type, what's it called? California specific stuff. I typed CA. I'm seeing all of the objects that I can insert here that begin with the search term I just used. So there, I just typed, I didn't even need to go into the editor. If you know what you want, you can save yourself a ton of time with just auto resolve. All right, so now if I click Save Process, and I come back here to this form and reload it, I don't see Chakra at all. But if I choose California, I get it. And if I switch to American Samoa, I see nothing, no Chakra stuff going on here. That's just California. All right, so we should do that as well over here with some of the others. So and here's what I'm going to do here for California specific stuff. I'm going to clone this rule. And now I'm going to say Washington specific stuff. It's not a copy, and I will just change California to Washington. And instead of showing and hiding the Chakra level, I'm going to show and hide Starbucks locations. And again, you know, I can start typing and resolve. So this doesn't need to take a ton of time. There we go. And let's also do, let's clone this one more time. I think we had that Michigan thing with the hand position too, right? So let's do Michigan specific stuff. So if the state name equals Michigan, then we show, what do we call it, hand position? Yeah, that's the name of the field, hand position. If you don't choose something, like if I start typing HA, I see a couple of different things here. If I don't actually click on this, if I stop, that becomes a string literal. It's not what I want. Just want to warn you about it. There. All right, so that's what we want, and let's save the process, and this time refresh the form again. And now I'm seeing almost nothing. Oh, I'm not seeing hand position. Did I express this rule wrong? No. If state name equals Michigan, show hand position. Oh, right, of course. I created these 3 rules, but I'm not using them everywhere. So let's go ahead and go back to state. And I'm going to invoke more than 1 rule. So I'm going to execute California specific stuff, but then I'm also going to execute Washington specific stuff. And I'm also going to execute Michigan specific stuff. The other thing I'm going to do is go back here to the form and do the same thing here. Washington specific stuff and Michigan specific stuff. Now I can save my process and return here and reload the form, and I see almost nothing. I'm saving this other thing for later. In fact, I want to deal with this right now. Other, I don't want showing up. I'm happy to have it stay on the form. Some people like to leave the field on the form but disable it unless it's meant to be used at a given time. So just so that we prepare for this, I'm going to go to the field matrix here, and other I want to have as read only, at least for now. All right, let's go back. Reload. Exactly what I want. So if I choose California, I will see chakra level. And if I choose Washington, I'm supposed to put in which Starbucks locations are near me. And if I choose Michigan, I need to indicate where on my hand my city is. And if I choose any other state in the United States, I don't have to deal with any of that stuff. So that, my friends, is conditional display logic in action. Some of the stuff, which is I don't want people to see conditional display logic. I'll tell you what, let's do one more thing, because you know what I'm not seeing here is conditional display based on where you are in the workflow. And you don't need to use rules for that. Let me show you what I'm talking about. You would be tempted here in the change request lifecycle to say that if I have a field that should only be visible during the review stage, to have a rule saying check current stage and hide or show. You don't need that. We have the field matrix for that, but I don't have a form field here to do that. So how about I put in an extra form field, and I call this recommendations. In truth, I could be using the comments field for that, but let's dedicate a field to it. And I'm going to make it multiple lines of text. And I will even go so far as to make it rich text, not just standard text. And I will come back here to the main form. Here it is. It shows up now. I don't want recommendations to be visible during the start. These are review recommendations. So they're going to be here, visible during the review stage, and in fact required during the review stage. If we're finished or it's canceled, I want it to be visible but hidden, or I'm sorry, but read only. But no, during the start, I don't want the author to see review recommendations, at least not yet. So that's how I deal with, and you'll see here, there are no the field absolutely exists now. It's just not relevant at this point. In fact, let's say paint sky red. And I will say that my state is Arizona, and I will submit. There's no person to assign the workflow to. Check the configuration. This is another mistake I deliberately made in order to show you something. Although it occurs to me, the next slide is not use rules for task assignments, but I'm going to make an executive decision and introduce it now. Here's my workflow process. Here's my path that says submit. And here is where I create a task on the submit path to somebody. And yes, we have the ability to have predefined roles. In fact, more often than not, we assign something to the author's manager, which is listed here as superior. If there's a field in the form that contains a person or group or contains information on people, I can choose a field there and a column in the field to that contains the task assignee. That's good for dynamic purposes. But what I want to do here is to use a business rule to assign who should be doing this. And this is our business rule editor. And what it's defaulting to is a built-in function called users. And I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to select something from somewhere. So how about we go to integration and I choose a data source value. And I am going to click here into the data source value. This is still the rules editor. It's just getting a little more interesting now. And so I will, let's see, pull data from a given data source. These are all of the ones I have registered. And we've got this one called all BPS users. Which column do I want to return? Well, I want to return the BPS ID. That works. So does the email. They'll both work. And the number of rows to return, just the first that we get, or all of them. In this case, the first one is going to be fine because I only want to assign this to one person. And so here is where I would put in a filtering expression to indicate who should get this task. And so what I'm going to do, actually, you know something, I'm going to, where, let's see, data source columns. Yeah, let's do this. Like I don't have a lot of choices because this is a simpler kind of design. So I can have text matching like and is in, and those are my choices. So what I'm going to do is say display name. I could have equals and empty and all of that, but it occurs to me let's use the like. So display name is like a. All right, now I'm not sure how this is going to work. I have a couple of choices here. This actually resolves to SQL. And if you want to look at the SQL, there it is. This is probably more detail than you want. But yeah, we resolve this stuff to SQL when we need to. But I can also test it and see whether or not it brings back the results I want, and it's not. So let's try, one of two things are going on. Either we are using .NET style syntax, in which case the asterisk is the wildcard character, or we are passing this through SQL style, in which case the % is the wildcard character. And sure enough, that's the one that works. And if I wanted to pass values from a stored instance, I could choose the ID from a current workflow instance stored in the database and use it. It defaults to the most recent one, but you can load any ID you want and then try it out that way. But this works fine. All right, so we're going to take the first person with a name beginning with A is the person who's going to get this. And I can live with that. All right, so I'm using a business rule to assign a task. And now I should no longer get yelled at when I try to submit this. By the way, if it's rejected, that means we need to assign it back to the author. And just for hygiene purposes, I want to make sure I do that right now. Okay, let's save the process. Let's return here and let's submit it. This is also a fine opportunity for me to demonstrate instant change, because instant change allowed me to make changes while I had the form open and the process running. And you now see that paint the sky red, it's in the review step, and it's assigned to the first person whose name begins with A, which happens to be some guy named Alf. And if I go here to Alf and I check Alf's process portal, we're a multilingual platform, and Alf tends to work in French. This is not a problem for us. So I can look at his tasks, and I see, sure enough, there is the recommendations field that needs to be filled out. Everything else is read only, exactly the way we would expect. So I'm happy with this, and I hope you're happy with it too. Let's jump back. That's conditional field display. Now we're going to go to conditional field validation. And so here's what I want to do. Conditional field validation is, in the simplest of terms, I can get quite a bit of mileage. If your only main concern in conditional field validation is that something not be blank, you just go back to the field matrix and you mark something required, like other, for example. If I wanted to have a value in there, I do that. But there are other ways that I can do conditional field validation. How about I say I want other to be required, but only, actually, no, I take that back. I'm not going to mess with other. We're saving that one for later. This Starbucks location thing, this chakra level thing, this hand position thing, I don't just want them to be displayed. I want them to be required when the state is the correct state. Now, the way I'm going to do that is, I'll show you. If I go here to hand position, this is the one for people from Michigan, right? I have this area here called editability and requiredness. And here I have a place where I can put in an editability restriction. And here I have a place where I can put in a requiredness restriction. Now, a couple of things are important to note. This is evaluated when the form loads. Same thing here with visibility. I also have a place to put rule logic here as well, but it's only evaluated when the form loads. This here on editability and requiredness, this is evaluated when the form is requiredness is evaluated when the form is submitted. So one way I can get extra, no, that's not quite right. This is evaluated constantly. Let's adjust it. So what I want is for hand position to be required, but I only want it to be required when the state is equal to Michigan. So let's go ahead and put in let's see, I need state. And again, now that you know that we've got this auto resolve thing going on, I don't need to go into the editor for everything. And there, remember, this resolves to true or false. This is a business rule. So state ID and name is equal to Michigan, therefore hand position is going to be required. Now this doesn't work unless I also make it required here. This rule that I've done here, its job is to refine what's going on in the field matrix. The field matrix is always where we start. So this is actually a way for me to shut off a requiredness restriction that's in the field matrix. So it's only required if this is equal to Michigan. The table of Starbucks locations is only going to be required if the state is equal to Washington. Now I haven't saved anything yet, so to show you what I'm talking about, let's create a new item. Let's choose a state. I'll choose California, and you see that chakra level shows up, but it's not required like title is. I don't see a little asterisk here. I don't want you to choose California and not give me a chakra level. That's what we're dealing with here right now. So if you're in Washington, you better tell me which Starbucks locations are near you. And let's see. Where was I? Chakra level, yes. If you're not familiar with chakras, it's a concept in, well, not just Buddhism, but other things. It's centers or locuses of energy, spiritual energy. Let's see. No, sorry, state equals, and that would be bad because that would just put the literal string stat there. And state name equals California. In fact, that's a good thing. Let me double check on Michigan and Washington because, yeah, it's not ID and name, it's just name. Same thing here. Name. All right, so let's click save. So I'm using a business rule to refine the field matrix. And now, if I reload this form, and I see California, not only do I see that it's chakra level is here, but I'm not seeing chakra level required. Why did I forget to make it required in the field matrix? Yep, I did. So let's see. I should make state required. I don't want someone to not give me a state. And Starbucks locations should be required. By the way, the requiredness thing, the way it works is if an item list is required, then you must have at least one item in the item list. And then the individual columns inside the item list can be required or not required, as the case may be. That's how that works. All right, let's see. That works. I shouldn't have to change anything other than just reload the form. There we go. State is required. Let's choose one. Now remember, I marked all of those other things as required, but I have rules in place that override that. So if I choose paint trees purple, and I say I'm from Arkansas and I submit it, it's accepted. If I do this one more time, however, paint trees red, and I say I'm from California, now I have a chakra level. And if I submit this without a chakra level, I'm being told it's a required field. And so now I need to say it's a 7th level chakra, and now I can submit it. So that's how you do some kinds of conditional field validation. Again, at the field level, this would be validating or manipulating a field's requiredness, which is the most common field validation thing we see out there. It's required if and only if. Now, it can get more interesting than that. Don't worry, I have thought of that. So that's conditional field validation. Conditional field editability works the same way. Let's go back over here. Well, I do want to be mindful of the time. Look, it works exactly the same way requiredness worked. Let's go back because I want to make sure you see custom form validation. It's not enough to validate with is it there or is it not? I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. Let's slide back over here. And what I want to do is say that if you're in Washington State and you have, I'm expecting you to fill in at least one Starbucks entry. All right, let's do that. In fact, let's go here and let's just say AAA, and I'll say I'm in Washington State, and that pops up this list of Starbucks locations. And if I try to submit this and I have no Starbucks locations, I'm in trouble. I required the table to have at least one entry in it. So if I click here on add, I'll say Main or Capitol Hill 1, and I'll say 15 Olive Way, capacity 30 people. All right, now this should be legit. Except I think somebody's fudging that data because there is no way that that's legal. there are at least 2 Starbucks next to that area. I mean, in fact, I believe there's a Starbucks across the street. That's just how crazy it is here in Seattle. So I want to make sure there's at least 2. How am I going to do that? I'm not going to be able to do it with a normal rule. I'm going to be able to do it with a form rule that's actually specified inside of the workflow. So as I move from start to review, I don't want submit to successfully complete unless a custom validation rule has been met. So let's go here to submit. Let's go here to parameters, and you see another additional path validation form rule. So what I want to do is there is a field I've constructed that's being automatically maintained by an item list. There's another webinar out there on how item lists work and how they're very, very cool. And so what I'm going to do here is yell at you if I'm not happy. So let's see, the validation rule to execute is if, and there we go. All right, so if this field that I have called count of locations is greater than 1, I'm going to say, I'm expecting you to name at least 2. Then we're going to do, we will return positive. Otherwise, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to return, we're going to alert you to something being bad, and we'll return negative. So alert is you live in Washington State, name at least 2 Starbucks locations. All right, and I'll click here to do another thing, and I will return negative. All right, save the process. And so all I'm going to do is, I could put in here, and if I've got only 1, it won't be enough. That's how you deal with complex validation requirements. Custom task assignment, you saw that already. Conditional paths, let me show you. We're running down to the wire, but now that you've seen how rules work in general, I don't need to construct one in front of you every single time. Let's go back to the workflow designer, and I'll show you where you do conditional paths. So I have the option here to start it, and then it goes to the review stage, and then it could be finished or canceled. What if I want to have the option for this to be canceled even when it's in the review stage? Maybe the author decides while it's being reviewed that it's a dumb idea, and they just want to withdraw the whole thing. They don't even want it to be considered for review anymore. Even though it's in the hands of the author, we want to retain some responsibilities on the part of the author to cancel it. So I want the author to see cancel, and I want the task assignee to see approve and reject. All right, so here's how we're going to solve this. The author always has the ability to see the item because they created it. What I'm going to do, however, is open this up, and we're going to look at the paths. And you'll see additional path validation form rules. You saw that already, but what you didn't see already here is visibility restrictions on paths. So I certainly want the author to be able to pick this up and cancel it. So let's go here to cancel. And the visibility restriction will be this. I need an equal sign. And here I want context, as in current user. If the current user equals a system field called author also log in. We want to make them match up. If they're together, then we will display cancel. If, on the other hand, that's not the case, they won't see it. So I could do the same thing to approve and reject and make sure that they only show up for the task assignee. And in terms of how you know who is assigned a task, that shows up, let's see, current user, assigned persons. You can see who's assigned directly. You can see who is assigned with a courtesy copy. And that's how I could make other paths only show up if you were directly assigned to it, as opposed to just someone who is able to read it and open it, but not make these two decisions. So if you want to restrict paths, it's actually really easy. You do it with rules. Conditional workflow actions. One more thing to show you quickly. It could very well be that if someone clicks approve, I want something to happen. So for example, if I follow the approve path, I might want this workflow action to execute. And this workflow action might execute an SQL query or send out a custom notification message. And if I do that, great. But you'll notice here we have active. That's turning it off all or nothing. But I could have here an execution condition that says only execute this if the following business rule conditions are met. That's really, really handy. And then I can even execute transact SQL functions from inside business rules. You saw me query a data source before. Let me open up this different item. And what I've got here is a form rule that assembles a full address. And what it's doing is checking to make sure all of the fields have been filled in, and then and only then it calls a business rule that concatenates the full address. Now we have a number of text manipulation functions here, but it turns out there is one particular function I'm particularly fond of. Oh, I wanted to put in what I just like the way Transact SQL does it, and there are a couple of quick tricks it does that I find a little bit easier. So just because of my biases and comfort areas, I am passing in those field values, form fields, to an SQL statement that just issues a select. It's not selecting anything from any table. I'm just basically using SQL's concatenation operators and so on to return a full address. And that's okay. Perfectly okay to use SQL to do your bidding for things that have nothing to do with querying data. You don't have to do that. If I were able to pull it off comfortably with a whole bunch of text functions, you could do that. I actually found this a little bit easier. It's just me. I also did it just to prove a point. Last thing, custom email notifications. I had just created this. It was an action that sent out a custom email. Let's go here to configure. And if I'm going to configure that custom email, let's go here. You always see the functions picker, the values picker, the object picker. That can be used to populate any of these fields. We're using rule syntax in order to do that. Same thing with message content. If I want to insert fields, I've got the same rule functions and the same value functions. I have very few functions actually available to me unless they're inside of a business rule, but that's okay. I can use business rules to create custom text. I have other techniques for that too, but that could be quite handy if I have really complex logic as to what belongs inside of an email message. All right, a very quick thing to tell you about. In an upcoming webinar, since I just scratched the surface on SQL, we will talk about how you can use business rules to call custom code. We can talk about using business rules for usage analysis. We can actually talk about very elaborate SQL queries, including querying our own metadata. If you wanted to assign something to a group of people except for people that had already been assigned tasks in the past, or except for if there are a lot of different permutations to how you do something, at some point it might warrant an SQL query, in which case, yeah, we've got a way to do that, and we'll talk about it another time. So in conclusion, you get a consistent expression language. You get form behavior and back-end calculations in the box. You get radical reuse of logic. You get testability. You get the option, we didn't really talk about this, but the option to drop to JavaScript and SQL if you really need to. And again, I don't recommend doing this unless it's truly necessary. We edited this as a form rule, which means we're using our form rule syntax, our drag and drop, point and click, auto complete type thing. But you know something? This translates to this JavaScript. And this is very carefully written JavaScript that makes sure that very little, if anything, can go wrong. But if you want to write your own JavaScript, change this from form rule mode to JavaScript mode and go nuts. And we provide you with a bunch of functions to get at and get and set fields and hide and show things. You've got lots and lots of choices here. So we love you even if you want to go crazy with JavaScript. Occasionally it might even be necessary, but it's pretty rare. And of course, every single one of these rules can be changed instantly and have it affect everything, including currently running instances, as is true of everything with WebCon BPS. It's a better way to workflow, the WebCon way. Thank you very, very much for attending this webinar. And next week, don't forget, we're going to talk about how we address agile organizations. We handle merger and acquisition scenarios, surrogates and substitution scenarios, and divisional differences. There are a lot of features that come together to make this work. Just come back next week. It'll be fun. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now. Oh, I see a couple of questions. Let's address them. If you click on the logic in the field, you can create a form rule without copy paste. Oh yeah, someone is noticing that there are some extra things. If you click on the logic in the field, you don't have to do copy paste, but it's the nice thing about it is you get several different ways to get this done. Thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day. See you next week.